Welcome to Selecting an Intervention. What is an evidence-based intervention? So both the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, and the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the ESEA, require that schools use programs, curricula, and practices based on scientifically based research to the extent practicable. This means that whenever possible, the educational interventions being used must be strongly supported by evidence from well-conducted research studies. Educational research may be said to be scientific when it has several pieces. First is using a sound research design. So the outcomes of the students receiving a tested teaching strategy or intervention are compared to similar students who do not receive the intervention. It also needs to be based on high-quality data analysis. So this means that researchers must be sure to carefully collect, store, and examine the data. And then lastly, it needs to involve other researchers to review the results. So the study needs to be reported in a journal so that other researchers can review the methods used and then repeat the research in other settings. So when we're looking for evidence-based strategies, we need to ask ourselves these questions. The first question is, has research been conducted to evaluate the strategy? So if we're looking at what we think might be an evidence-based strategy and there's no research behind it, we already know that it is actually not an evidence-based strategy because there is no evidence to show that research has been conducted. The second question is, does the specific strategy include an assessment of the current student's performance, followed by implementation of the strategy beyond the baseline? So we want to make sure, of course, that before we put evidence-based strategies in place that we are collecting baseline data, but then we want to also be sure that there is some sort of implementation of the strategy beyond just collecting that data. The third is making sure that there are requirements for data collection and progress monitoring of their progress. So if there really aren't any requirements for data collection, or there really is no way to monitor the progress of the student, then it really isn't a good evidence-based strategy. We're also looking for what are the skills that will be addressed in this strategy, or what are the measurable outcomes. We want to make sure that when we are choosing strategies, that we are choosing strategies that are actually addressing skills and teaching skills. We want to make sure that we're not choosing something that is just reinforcement. So an example of this might be that if we have a student who has a behavior that we are wanting to extinguish or teach coping strategies for, or teach a replacement behavior, and we come across a strategy that is basically giving a student a sticker every time they show us expected behavior or the behavior that we are wanting to see, but there's no way to teach that skill. There's no skills that are addressed. It's just the giving of the sticker. That's actually a reinforcement. That's not an actual evidence-based strategy that's being taught. The goal is to fade reinforcement eventually. And so if you haven't taught your student a skill to cope with that behavior or to replace that behavior, once the stickers are getting taken away, you're going to see that behavior just come rearing out again. And then the last is, what are the benefits and limitations of the strategy? So every strategy that you come across is most likely going to have some sort of limitation. Not every strategy is going to be completely perfect, but you want to make sure that the benefits outweigh the limitations much more. Some examples of limitations where the strategy would just be, a deal breaker or a hard no would be, for example, if it costs a lot of money, or if it's extremely time consuming and it's not something that is going to fit into your day or into the student's day. So what stage of learning is your learner in with the target skill? This is something that we want to figure out prior to jumping in with an intervention. So think about what you learned when you were conducting your riot. Think about a couple of classes ago when we were talking about, is it a skill deficit or is it a performance deficit? So is this a new skill? So is this something that is going to be newly introduced to the student? Or are you building on a skill that has been previously introduced? So on the next few slides, we're going to discuss the different level of skill development. And while you are listening to me speak about these pieces, make sure that you're thinking about where your learner might fall. And by the end, you should be able to determine where your learner falls within these different levels. So the first is acquisition. So acquisition means that the student is learning the new skill or concept for the first time. And an example of this, and we're going to use, you'll see throughout all of the different levels, we're going to use the same student as an example throughout the different levels. So this student is a student with reading difficulties, and they're introduced to a phonics-based reading intervention. During this stage, the student is learning how to decode simple words using the new strategy. So an intervention example would be that the teacher explicitly teaches letter sound correspondences, breaking down words into smaller parts. So for example, if we have the word cat, then it's being broken down as k, at. The student needs significant support and modeling to understand the process. The next stage of learning is fluency. So this means that the student is becoming more proficient and efficient at performing the new skill. The same student is now able to decode words more quickly and accurately after repeated practice. An intervention example of this is the student practices decoding words daily, but now with timed exercises to build that speed and that fluency. The teacher uses tools like flashcards or reading passages, and the student is now reading simple words correctly in a set time limit, though not yet at grade level. The next stage is maintenance. So this means that the student can retain the new skill over time, even after direct instruction on the skill has ended. So an example of this would be that the student is able to decode words independently without reminders from the teacher. An intervention example of this would be that after several weeks, the teacher checks the student's ability to decode previously learned words without even reteaching them. So this is just kind of like a cold check on the student, what the student had learned several weeks previously, and there's been no reteaching. And the student is now able to read familiar words accurately during those independent reading sessions. So they're maintaining that skill even when there isn't reteaching going on. The next is generalization. So this means that the student can apply the skill across different contexts, settings, or tasks. And an example of this would be that the student uses the decoding skills not just in the reading intervention setting, but also in the general ed classroom and at home. The intervention example would be that the student is able to decode new words that they've encountered in other reading materials, like a science or a social studies lesson, and when reading books at home. The intervention has equipped the student to apply the decoding strategy to unfamiliar words to them. And then the last is adaptation. So this means that the student can modify the skill to fit new or unique situations. So an example of this is that the student is able to adjust their decoding strategies when encountering multi-syllable words or words with irregular spellings. An intervention example of this would be that the student adapts the decoding skill to read more complex words using chunking strategies for multisyllabic words. So for example, fantastic becomes fan-tas-tic, and recognizing common exceptions to phonics rules. They also employ context clues to assist in word recognition when decoding is not straightforward. So these are all of the different skill levels. And I hope while I was going through these, you were thinking about your student and where they fit. Most of your students are probably going to be in the acquisition or the fluency stage. There might be a few in the maintenance stage. Most probably aren't going to be in the generalization or the adaptation stage for your EBP. So let's look at an example together. We're going to be thinking about metacognition and self-monitoring. So what is that? So metacognition is an awareness of one's thought processes and an understanding of the patterns behind them. So this can take many forms, like reflecting on your way of thinking and knowing when and how you and others use particular strategies for problem solving. So we're going to be taking a look at an intervention for self-monitoring. So you can see here that it's got the age and the grade level. So this can be performed with anybody from second grade to high school. It really can be performed in a variety of settings. It is done individually. And so the desired or appropriate behavior would be on task behavior or task accuracy, task completion, anger management, relaxation, hand raising to ask a question, making appropriate comments. And the skill level could be anywhere from fluency to generalization. So the student at least would need to be in the acquisition phase, would need to have passed through the acquisition phase in order to be able to utilize this intervention. So self-monitoring is a part of overall self-regulation, and it's basically the most common form of self-management strategies taught to children. It requires a variety of prerequisite skills such as self-observation, self-recording, and self-reinforcement or rewarding for meeting or exceeding some pre-established goal. So self-monitoring has often been thought of just a measure of the progress of another intervention strategy, but self-monitoring alone can change behaviors. Self-monitoring strategies can decrease dependence on others like teachers, peers, parents to change behavior, thereby increasing the likelihood of the child generalizing the behavior to new, novel, and or different settings and or people. Several targets are included in self-monitoring, such as monitoring their attention, their task accuracy, their task performance, mood, anxiety. So you can see here that the materials are a self-monitoring intervention worksheet, self-monitoring forms, and then a cueing device. Either like a beep tape or a person prompting or some sort of an alarm. And then also a reinforcer list so that once the student is accurately performing this self-monitoring or even just participating, the student can be reinforced. And then you can see here that there is a procedure for the interventionist. So when we're thinking about a couple of slides ago, when we were thinking back to, what really makes an evidence-based practice, we're seeing a lot of research citations here. We're seeing that they have some materials that need to be included. They've got a procedure here. They even have a rationale and research to support. So this is a very strong example of an intervention. There's also a video example of self-monitoring and metacognition. I'm going to be posting this link on our weekly module as well. Please watch the video and think about what you noticed and what skill level you might say that the learner is at. As you're watching him go through the checklist, be thinking about what went into getting him to the level that he is currently at and how you might do the same with your learners if this is something that you might be doing with your learners in the future or even your current learner. So we're going to be looking at a few slides coming up here of examples of possible interventions. Based off of what you see and what you know about choosing an evidence-based intervention, decide if what you are seeing on the slide has a high probability of being research-based or a low probability of being research-based. So here we have 40 reading intervention strategies for K through 6 students. And you can see here that this is a book and there's a bunch of reading intervention strategies in here. Giving just a minute for you to think about whether or not you think it's low or it's high. And in this case, this is something that most likely would be highly research-based. You can see on the cover it says research-based support for RTI. You most likely would find some evidence-based strategies in here for a learner. The next is a main idea tree piece of paper. You can see that it's a tree and that the main idea is at the top and then there are some details. This would be an example of lower evidence-based. This is something that could be considered a support if you were teaching a student a writing strategy, but you would actually have to teach the strategy to them. This next here is how to build sight word vocabulary with the reading racetrack. And this would be kind of somewhere in the middle. It does have some citations, but they are a little bit older. This might be something where you could, if you liked this, you could maybe do some further research to see what you could find in terms of support, in terms of research for using the Reading Racetrack to build sight word vocabulary. And then this last one is Look, Ask, Pick, otherwise known as LAP. You can see here that there's an age and grade level suggestion, there's setting suggestions, looking for the desired appropriate behavior suggestions here. It gives you the skill level, it gives you rationale and research support, there's multiple references. So this would be considered highly evidence-based. You can see here it's got many different pieces to it that make it highly evidence-based between all of the different references and citations and all of the information that it gives you. And then this last one is from the Autism Helper, and this is Focus on 5 Teacher Time Math Themes for each day of the week. So this would be something that would not be considered evidence-based. This is basically coming from a blog, and you want to make sure that whenever you are grabbing strategies that you're getting them from something that is highly evidence-based. Blogs are fine to pull supplemental materials like the main idea tree or some cute materials that you might use to support your strategies or your lessons, but you want to make sure that whatever you are teaching is an evidence-based strategy. So now that we've learned all about how to choose the intervention, you are actually going to get to choosing your intervention. So in Canvas on 390 under modules and then EBP and then EBP resources, you will see that there is an interventions page. When you go to that page, there are several ideas for interventions. Take some time to search through them, read through them. Those are all examples of interventions that are available for you to use with your specific learner on the area of concern if it fits. If you look through those and you do not think that any of them fit, then you are welcome to choose your own intervention. And here are just some website resources. This is definitely not all of the website resources out there, but just some that you might want to check out. You can look at interventioncentral.org. There's a Reading Racetrack tutorial on YouTube, and that is, we also just looked at the Reading Racetrack a couple of slides ago. Teaching LD, they have other academic content areas. My Breakfast Reading Program, there's some sight word memorization. And then the University of Missouri, there is a list of math interventions. So make sure you are using the correct citation for the actual intervention when you are completing your part 3 and your part 4. There will be another video that is covering part 3 as well as part 4. So those are pieces that you do need to cover this week as well.